Welcome, folks, to our next episode of America's Future Series, Space Talks. Today, we are joined by Professor Timiebi Aganaba Jeanty of Arizona State University. Professor Aganaba Jeanty has 3 degrees in law and policy, with her thesis being geared toward policy, and she also has a degree in space management from the International Space University. She is one of the leading voices in governance of space. And we're really honored to have you join us today. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us.
Thank you.
As we start off, one of the things that our audience is interested in particular, and we're going to be talking about today, is the framework of how we can think as people who are not experts in your field, because some of us are experts in the technical side, like me. I'm a physicist by training. Others come from more of a defense and security role. Others are business leaders, and so what your research and work has been in the area of space governance is really important, and needs and we need to understand what you're developing. So we're going to jump into that in a moment, but before we do, could you tell us a little bit more about your path and who you are, and how you got into space law and economics and policy?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So I always start off this joke that a British, Canadian, Nigerian outer space lawyer walked into a bar, because people never imagine somebody having all those nationalities and then working in space, because obviously we know that space is very challenging because it's quite nationalistic, even though the whole ethos around space is that it's supposed to be international and collaborative. You'll very rarely, I'll probably be the only British, Canadian, Nigerian outer space lawyer you ever meet. So my path into space is actually very interesting and unique. So I was born and raised in the UK, and went to law school in the UK, and decided to discover my roots by going to Nigeria. And when I went to Nigeria, I went to law school in Nigeria, and really this is where I started understanding different legal systems, the way things work, and really understanding that international law, or this concept of law that applies to everyone, is it's very nuanced, because it depends on what lens you're using to kind of come at it. So it was very fascinating to now understand international law was actually established by a very small group of actors. And when I now studied law kind of in the African context, I realized there's so many factions to it and so many aspects to it. It was really eye-opening experience. Now, when you graduate from university in Nigeria, you have to do a year's service for the country. It's called a National Youth Service. And I was posted as the first, National Youth Service post member in the Legal Affairs and International Cooperation Department of the Nigerian Space Agency. So here, I was researching Nigeria's positions to things like space debris and, how we can develop space education in the country. And it was just fascinating, because every time I told people that I was a Nigerian space lawyer in Nigeria, the first thing people would say is, we don't even have electricity. Like, people are starving and dying on the streets.
Have a space agency.
And you have a space agency. Like, what does that mean? And so this really led me to thinking, I need to go, and to be able to actually have an impact in these countries, I need to go and really learn, what is space about? What does it have to offer people all around the world? Or is it still this kind of big superpower kind of activity? So from there, I went to the International Space University and did an interdisciplinary program so that I could understand, how do you work with scientists and engineers and policymakers and business people? And I think that was one of the best things I ever did, that I started that very broad education before specializing in law and policy, because it taught me that you need to be inter or transdisciplinary, and you need to get lots of different perspectives to actually make the most meaningful kind of outcomes. And, from there, I went on to do a master's and PhD in space law and policy, focused on developing country perspectives and really how do we bring marginalized people into the fold. I don't want to go on too much longer because we'll talk about it further, but what I realized is, by this point, 10 years in, I was becoming too specialized on space and was becoming one of these echo chambers myself, So I did my postdoc in environmental law and at the Center for International Governance Innovation, because I wanted to learn, how do we innovate around global governance, and how do we learn lessons from other regimes to give lessons learned into the space sector. And I think that experience, I was working with emerging technologies, like obviously the buzz of 2017 was blockchain and AI
Right.
and all this. How does it all fit in? And I think that's what led me to getting my current job as an assistant professor at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University, which is ranked #1 for innovation, because we really look at what are the implications of these technologies for the future, and who is part of that future. Like, what does the future look like, and how do we affect the future? So that was my long answer of basically saying how I got here today.
No, but it's instructive. It's really instructive, because one of the things that jumps out at me is that you had the foresight, or the happy accident. We often, how often are those two things very muddled, right? To realize that when thinking about space and law, the interplay of international law and how that could evolve or grow is going to be critical. So given that you've worked in these different types of law in different countries, in different fields, would you be able to help or provide us with a mental framework that we can use to help them maybe even not understand yet, maybe nobody understands it yet, and we're going to evolve that as a future, but to organize our thoughts at least about the different aspects of interactions, laws, regulations, and societal concerns, both in space and associated with space?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And, I founded the Space Governance Lab because I like to think in terms of governance systems. I like to think of all these different components as part of a system about how do we regulate and organize our activities in space and the actors in space. Because I think historically, what happened in the beginning of the space era, the USSR and the US came together and realized that to make this a feasible activity, we need international regulation, we need international laws. And over time, what we've seen is that regime was established for the benefit of these actors, but now more and more people are coming into the fold, and you now see that international law becomes very difficult now that you had, all these new actors and all these new players, and international law doesn't really account very well for non-state parties. So how do you think about the different kinds of stakeholders that are emerging in the space sector, and how that interaction is with governing the regime, or with making it possible to have a variety of different kinds of activities? So we think of I think of it in terms of buckets of actors and activities. There's the international law component, because space is an international environment, and if we want to do anything in space, we need to be multilateral in the way we think about it. But of course, states are sovereign, and so in international law, there is no international police, there is no, we have the Security Council, but those are still countries. So countries are sovereign and determine themselves how they're going to implement international laws. So this is where national space policy comes in. And for instance, how do you implement, or how do you determine what your obligations are internationally? That's going to be based on your state position, what your national space policy says. And then bringing in further down from the state level, private companies, non-state actors. This is where your stakeholders' interaction and interrelation is really important, because their ideas, their objectives will feed into space policy,
Mm-hmm.
which will feed into international law. So it's kind of like a cycle.
It's a cycle, right?
It's a cycle, yes. And no one component is more than the other, but you will definitely have people who are in the different sections that are saying that their perspective is kind of the overarching, most important segment of it. In the US context, very much today's context is that we need the national to override the international, because the international regime is not fully formed. But the question is, well, who decided it should be that way? So it's interesting, because others would say, instead of going for a completely unilateral approach that the US is kind of taking right now, that they should be at the forefront of saying, let's all come together multilaterally, let's all come together and develop this international system together. But I think the US perspective is that's too slow. Not only is it too slow, your industries are not going to be upheld, or the vision that you have is not going to become true if you wait for the whole world, before you move forward. So at the United Nations level, when the regime first started, there were just 2 actors and about 20 countries that were in the committee that was establishing the regime. And today, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space has over 90 countries. So you can imagine, like at the UN level, trying to make anything happen today is really, really complicated. So I think the takeaway is basically, as we think about governance, as we think about how do we, think about coordinating all these activities and getting all the different stakeholders to be involved, we have to think about what are our objectives, and how far are we going to be nationalistic versus international versus global with respect to pushing this agenda. And it's challenging and difficult for the US because obviously, I think something like the global space civil budget is something like $70 billion, and over half of that is just the US alone. So the US has the most to benefit, the most to gain, the most to lose. And so you can understand why the US takes a unilateral approach sometimes. But we know that to have the kinds of futures that we want, where we have an in-space economy, the US cannot do it alone. And so you've got to get other people on board. And that's why you have to think more multilaterally.
So that's an amazing framework to think about. One thing that comes to mind directly to follow up on that question is, for the US, certainly, as you make a pointed remark about, is that there's a concept that we do not want to slow down our industries and the economic development of space. So what steps do you think that the US could take, rather to perhaps even still move unilaterally, but how can the US use the economics and possibly foreign policy to accelerate other countries joining the party?
Yes. So I think, we've all heard about the Artemis program and the Artemis Accords and the executive order that the president laid out that said that we should do this through international cooperation. And so clearly, the US's job is to create a framework, to create the conditions in which US businesses can flourish and grow. But I think what we have to recognize is that international cooperation is going to be very important, and you can still have leadership while you collaborate and work with different actors all across the board. And I think that the idea is that we have to take this careful balance not to alienate different actors. Yes, you've got to find who your partners are. And I think the Artemis Accords already has 8 countries that are signatories to that. So there's a starting board to say, look, here is actually a more diverse group than the International Space Station. We have Luxembourg in there, we have UAE in there. So the first start is diversifying who your partnership bases are, and not always thinking about the money. So when you cooperate with people, you need to have different levels in which your corporation operates.
Right.
And sometimes it might just be about increasing the capacity of the relationship, rather than, say, getting something really, really concrete technologically, because this paves the way to getting more buy-in kind of globally. So I think as we're seeing this diverse number of people all around the world showing interest in space, we need to have I would say, a kind of stepping stone approach to create platforms where people at different levels or different capacity can collaborate with you, right? So, be really meaningful about that, and not think just because somebody is not bringing a billion-dollar technology to the table that they're not relevant. They're relevant because geopolitics is relevant right now. For instance, in the African context, we would say the unique thing is that, there are over 14 African countries with space agencies. the African Union has adopted an African space policy, and an African space agency is coming online in 2023. And the US has been absent because of ITAR, and also because of not thinking it's relevant, has been absent from the region for the past 20 years. So the other actors, the China, Russia, the UK, have been prevalent in these countries. And I think those countries, maybe the fruitfulness of those collaborations, I would say, have not really materialized in the way that is best for those countries. And America is in a position right now to look at that, say, we've been out of action for these years. How do we now come in as service providers now that ITAR restrictions have been lowered somewhat, and get more of this political buy-in from the region? Because space, like we've got to remember, is not a silo in its own. It's part of other things. Right. I was just seeing, it's really interesting, in the State Department, I thought that space was under the portfolio of kind of oceans or polar region or the Arctic, but I saw that under the State Department, space is under a mandate of space and advanced technologies. So it's not based on that portfolio of jurisdictional, territories, but of actual applied technology. And so it's kind of relevant that you would be collaborating with people where you don't know where the next breakthroughs are going to come from. And I'm an African, but I would push that, Africa is, seeing itself as the potential territory, like moving on from where India and China started, to be a territory that people would find collaborative partners in the technological space.
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting point. Staying with that concept of globalization, of there needing to be some benefits for the U.S. both economically and politically to right, because I don't think, it seems like the argument of waiting is never going to gain any support, but the argument of helping others accelerate could have support. And it's a very interesting point that the vacuum that may have been created by America not being there has not been filled to mutual benefit for all parties involved. And so there may be a latent demand there for America and other Western or traditionally Western powers to enter and collaborate and find partnerships. One thing, just to stay on that concept, is with other parts with other types of technology and other fields, there have been comparative advantages. Now, Africa and Europe, America and Europe are farther north of the equator than is preferential for heavy launch. So at a minimum, there is some comparative advantage in equatorial Africa just for a launch site. But what I was interested in is that, are there other unique applications that perhaps don't make sense in America or in Europe that may find use in Africa? Kind of based on the concept that in Africa, so much of the population leapfrogged landline. They went straight to cell phone from not having a phone. Are there things like that space could deliver to the African continent? Whether it's skipping DSL and going straight to satellite internet, or other things perhaps. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question for me because I'm not technical enough to know what good technologies are there. But essentially, I think when,
from a societal standpoint, perhaps, or what the needs might be.
Right. So countries have had, when the technologies first came about, like for instance, when Earth observation first became big, countries were concerned. Actually, they were very concerned about what this technology meant. And so they weren't putting their foot forward to see how can we capitalize on this data and this information that's coming out to develop products and to develop things out of it. Rather, they were concerned with how do we make sure that our sovereignty is not, is not like basically that people aren't just coming here using space technology and then knowing what all our assets are and basically taking off. And I think what we've got to the point today is that we see that just because space technology is available, Earth observation information is available, doesn't mean that it's going to directly affect your sovereignty. Like because you still have you're still a sovereign nation, right? So I think these days countries in these regions are less concerned about how are they going to get hurt by this technology and what can they do to increase their capacity to be able to use it and be part of the conversation. In recent times, we've seen a lot of small tech companies coming up in Africa, and I think with this data boom, there's it's going to be a lot cheaper and a lot easier once they build up their capacity to be able to create products within these countries, if there are some collaborations that can kind of happen. And I think and I think it's been challenging for the world basically to think of how can we capitalize on all this extra data. I think because in the European context, for instance, when they were deciding, is Copernicus, which is the big mission, going to be completely free data, is that going to stimulate the sector, or is it going to be a challenge to companies that already exist? And so there was a fight between companies not wanting all this data to be free because there was already a small market. Well, we don't have
and they've spent money putting all that capability up.
Right. And in these countries, we don't have that because we don't have all these legacy systems. So they would be happy to create new sectors using all this free data and, making the downstream kind of get established. Now, as we're going to have these mega constellations coming up and trying to say we want to create more internet access within, in the underserved areas, of course, that's going to increase capacity and that's going to increase the level of things that people can do within these regions. So the opportunity is really there. But at the same time, the interesting thing is the debate that we have, say with the whole Starlink and all the satellite industry wanting more satellites up in space versus the astronomy community, also poses a challenge for these developing countries. Because, for instance, in Africa, we could be the place where that's where the dark skies are. So, right, because there's not so much light pollution within these regions. So if there's going to be all these new missions coming up, is there an opportunity to create a new tourism sector for planetary scientists and for astronomers within these countries? So, or are they just going to be in the middle in a tussle between, as always, as to who gets what? But they could come out and create this whole tourism aspect, not just tourism, but actual place for scientists to come. Kind of like how Hawaii, what Hawaii
right with Keck.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. There's that cycle that you alluded to earlier, right? And it just keeps kind of going around. Well, thank you for that insight. It's really powerful to think about how creating economic partnerships can be politically powerful and how having policy statements can be fundamentally economically enabling in the space arena as we move forward. So, to zoom out from Africa and the US a little bit and to zoom back to the global sense, on the concept, what do you see as the major questions we need to ask in terms of space governance and possibly answer in kind of the three time domains of development: 18 months, couple years, 5 years, and then looking to the future 10 years and beyond? Starting with the short term, perhaps.
Sorry, I've lost you. Okay.
All right, thank you so much for that, for framing this concept of economics and policy for us. Now zooming out a little bit, staying on the concept of policy influencing economics and economics being able to back influence policy. In terms of space governance, what do you see as the major questions we need to ask in kind of the short, middle, and long term? Say something like the next 2 years, the next 5 years, and 10 years, possibly, and beyond. Because it seems like there's a lot of things to figure out, and we're not going to figure out all of them quickly.
Yes. So it's interesting because the main topic that we need to think about right now, or that we're talking about on the global level, is one topic, but it has those segments split in it. So this idea of how do we move forward with all these multi-stakeholders? And there are things that need to be done in the short term and things that need to be done in the long term. In the long term, the reason that we care about all these stakeholders is because we believe in an in-space economy, right? We believe that humans are going to become spacefaring, and activities actually going to happen in space. Transactions will happen in space. And so how will that all get set up? Moving backwards, say in the next 20 years, how do we set that up in the short term? And I think on the international level, deciding at least what forum is appropriate to talk about these issues is one that we haven't even really determined yet, because it seems that lots of different actors have tried different forums and are trying to find which ones are most effective. And I mean, I'm in my research that I'm looking at right now, I have a proposal or an idea that I'm playing with that I don't even know if it's like very feasible or not. But for instance, at the United Nations, some actors, some people had a petition going around saying that the Secretary General of the United Nations should call for multilateral action for governing space resources, instead of the US position, whereby the 2015 Act basically says that if a US actor finds resources in space and brings them down or claims them, that the US will recognize them. And so, you know, people are saying the United Nations should call for a discussion on this. I was basically looking at the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, where these rules were established, was established as an ad hoc committee and then a full committee to basically develop the regime. But there was never a conference of the parties to the treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, the law that was established. There was never a meeting held by all the signatories to that. And if today we have over 100 countries that are signatories to that, and some of those people are not members of the committee, the UN committee.
Right.
So there's a disconnect between the members of the committee that set up the laws and the signatories today and future signatories of the outer space regime. So is that a potential forum? So one, in the very short term, we need to establish which forums are the best. Secondly, we have to determine this split between military and, you know, the military uses of space and the issue of weaponization versus commercialization. And that is, you know, that again is something that is a discussion that is split. But really, we still know that the military users are the #1 users of space today. Now, so they have their discussions, and, you know, the focus is all around thinking about how do we ensure that space doesn't become weaponized, because states are still thinking about anti-satellites and things like that, and because of the dependency that we have on space, should space become a war-fighting domain? You know, if we're still thinking about that as well as commercialization, you know, maybe it's naive to think that the space environment should be different from any other environment where you have interests, right?
Possibly,
so long as maybe it's naive to think that. And if we're more realistic, like with the establishment of the Space Force, and not just the US, Space Forces around the world, is the realization that space is not a benign environment, that it is a strategic asset. And so, you know, it's not just kumbaya, it's not just a place of peace and a place that we can have commercial activities. But I think commercialization, what it does do is it now shows that this is an interest that is like diversity involved, and many people could benefit greater if we try to prevent weaponization. So in the short term, the forum is really important for where we have these discussions. Then this split between weaponization and commercialization and what is our priority is super important. And then in the long term, it's really about, once we become spacefaring, or do we have to wait till we become spacefaring to think about how will we regulate people and activities in space? And I think on the short term, what the NASA have tried to do with respect to these new contracts for lunar soil
Right.
is instructive, because they're trying to say that, how do we start transactions in space? How do we say it's possible to actually purchase something in space, where NASA's trying to say, if someone can pick up some lunar dust, NASA will buy it to set precedent for transactions to actually happen. So we need a whole framework for transactions to happen. Maybe that's a short-term thing, but it sets us up for having an in-space economy that we're talking about over the next 20 years. So transactional, like precedents for transactions need to happen now. Forums for discussion need to happen now. And this discussion about how do we prevent weaponization and increased militarization of outer space.
So on that concept of continued use, and particularly non-military use, because at some level, space is a security asset. And so certain parts of that will continue. At some level, they may be needed to defend commercial assets.
Right.
So it's an interesting interplay. How do you see the use of space by us Earthlings evolving? And how can we possibly better use space to help people on Earth? I mean, right now, everybody is very, very obsessed with the data products. And there's a lot of uses for them, but what we're also realizing is all the limitations. Some things were overpromised and underdelivered. Other things were underpromised and overdelivered. So as often happens, the economics and commercial use scenarios, that's messy, and it sorts itself out like a market does, which is in a semi-chaotic fashion, I suppose. But looking forward to kind of perhaps beyond the data, what do you see us using space for the benefit of people, and also taking that forward beyond just use on Earth?
Right, and I think the challenging thing here is that the current priority from a non-technical standpoint, from a governance standpoint, is lunar governance, and how we govern our activities on the moon, which right now does feel and seem far removed from the common man on the ground, because the whole idea of the activities on the moon is using the moon as a gateway to the rest of the solar system. So it's very space exploration focused, because the idea is that the resources that are on the moon, for instance, if we find water, we can split that into hydrogen to make fuel, and we can have these fueling stations, to be able to explore. The lunar gateway itself, again, is another gateway into the solar system, vis-a-vis or in contrary to, say, the International Space Station, which today we still haven't, some would say, $100 billion later, we still haven't really benefited fully from that. So the question is, if this focuses on lunar government and going to Mars and going to the moon, how do you get others to be involved or to benefit from that? And this is the challenge. Like you say, the immediate benefit that we saw to people all around the world was, the data products, and was, using, so for instance, for developing countries, using space data to be able to know what your fishery stocks are like, kind of traditional stuff that haven't really materialized. And so it feels like it seems that there's two, we're banking on lunar governance, and we're banking on this internet access through these mega constellations. And the problem with the mega constellations and the internet access for all is that these companies, they start off talking about underserved areas, and you're thinking about marginalized people, but it ends up being underserved areas. We're talking about cruise ships, and we're talking about military uses in places that is not the underserved or the poor. You know, it's underserved in terms of, I think,
Economic markets that are underserved.
exactly, economic markets, which is completely understandable because these are companies and they need to have a return on investment. Um, who should be really serving the underserved if it's not the government? So you know, all that is to say that we're banking on Starlink and all this to be accessible to indigenous communities, to, you know, the poor and all that, but it's still pretty expensive and it's still challenging to say what that is. We're looking at lunar governance and going to other solar systems and saying that they're going to carry people along and they're going to make the in-space economy something that relates back to the Earth economy, but we're not 100% sure. So I think it's really challenging as we develop more and more activities that are space exploration focused. That seems to be quite a Western kind of agenda. And really, I think for other countries or for the rest of the world to really benefit from space, we still have to make the case for what are the new activities that are going to really benefit everyone.
So one thing that brings to mind is, for example, um, with GPS, which is fundamentally a space technology, right? It created one point. Different people have calculated this in different ways. Some I've read numbers of $1.4 trillion of economy that were created due to GPS. I've seen larger numbers, some that are quite large, like 10 trillion. It depends on how you calculate it. But um, what about how does the concept that in going to space we will learn how to do things, for example, in sparse environments, low power, low resource, uh, etc., that then turn into opportunities on Earth?
Right.
How does that play against the concept of the commercial uses? Because it's not clear that commercial entities will be the first to go to Mars or go back to the moon, but that would be government or colonize either of those. That might be government entities. So how does that interplay in that cycle that you mentioned in your framework?
Yeah. So, I mean, for
Yeah,
years we've talked about spin-offs, right? Like,
right, right.
you
NASA's
know, all,
publication is called Spinoff, right? About all
yes,
the
all the,
technology that come out of this that are related to everything else, not just
yes,
space.
yes. But the funny thing is, the interesting thing is, I mean, I don't want to speak for the NASA case, but I think we also overplay that because when I was a consultant for a space consulting company in Canada, and one of the things that I had to do was help the Canadian Space Agency on its commercialization of its technology. And so basically trying to find people to license the technology. And it's very challenging. You have to do it's very challenging to figure out how do you spin these technologies off in a way that is, you know, really accessible and easy to companies to actually utilize. And it takes a lot of specific work to show people how that technology can be spun off. And I think not enough, we say spin off, spin off, spin off, spin off, but we don't talk enough about all the groundwork that has to be done to allow that to happen. And in fact, we also downplay the spin in. So from other sectors, how did they come in to help the space sector to be better? And I think that's
Right.
also an important thing too, because as more and more people are hearing about space, and as we are, you know, trying to articulate more what this vision of space will be like, and doing more normal activities in space, we actually need a lot of spin in. We need ideas from other sectors about how to be more efficient, and how to utilize the skills that already exist, rather than always just talking about spin-offs, because I think it's actually harder than we can imagine to get the spin-offs. So it's the spin-offs and the spin-ins kind of working together, and a lot more emphasis has to be put in that ecosystem. And I think NASA have the Space Act agreements that
Right.
they're doing right now, trying to find that platform in which to promote to people that, hey, NASA have all this technology to license. can you go ahead? I think, Shelley Brunswick has been talking about that, and I know other
Right.
people have been talking about that too. So that just goes to show you that it hasn't been that easy. We actually have to put efforts now to show people how they can spin off that technology. And I think that the challenging thing about some of the way that the space market is characterized, which is why you have so much of a problem talking about what the actual figure is because some studies put things in with space that others would say is not space.
Okay.
Or
Right.
is it
It depends on where you draw the lines.
Right. It depends on whether you draw the line. I think we had this big thing with broadcasting,
Yes.
as well. Is that space? Is it not space? It might be smaller if we're talking about, the
I mean,
range of
telecom in
service.
general, at some level, right? You can say how
Yeah.
much of that is fundamentally space dependent. I mean, clearly it's critical, but how much of the value of telecom is really in space?
Right. So I mean, I'm not trying to completely downplay space, but what I'm saying is that I think we need to better characterize the value chain and better characterize, where people can come in,
Right.
what points they can come in and actually have impact, and have less narratives that are kind of blowing things up, like you said we did with the Earth observation thing, right? That it's something bigger than it actually is.
Right. I mean, I know a lot of companies that are working very diligently to try to monetize that data, but a lot of it is doing. There are certain key verticals, watching maintenance, security, surveillance, crops, livestock, and certain things around water. But it's challenging. It's very challenging because a part of it is that there's this investment ratio of how much is it going to cost to get the next great detection system up there that can do all this stuff versus what's the total accessible market and how much will actually be accessed. So that ROI calculation is challenging to do. And the capability, it's really that discussion at some level is the case for Copernicus, because there's going to be limits on what industry is going to want to do, because they're going to go after the big markets, low-hanging fruit, right? Because that's where the maximum ROI is. And then some of the more niche applications that could be very important to society, to people's daily lives, but don't have such a huge ROI, or maybe have a negative ROI. Would industry really jump into that? Would it occur as an ancillary effect, based off of some other work? And I guess it's not clear. It's going to be messy moving forward. Thank you for helping us sort through this a little bit.
Yeah, there's the niche. I mean, I'm always in the niche areas. The niche application that I'm following right now is greenhouse gas emissions monitoring.
Right.
And I don't know when this is going to come out, but I'm moderating a panel for the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat because, for my postdoc, I was looking at, basically countries self-report their emissions data to the United Nations. And so whatever your philosophy is about how trustworthy you think states are and how much they actually doing stuff in climate action.
Can we independently verify it using
yes,
satellite
can we
data?
Independently, exactly. And this is quite tough. It's a tough thing to do, but actors are starting to work on it. Al Gore has a project coming out called Climate Trace, where they're basically trying to use satellite imagery with AI and machine learning, obviously, and other companies are too, to be able to detect emissions coming from individual installations. Something like this is like, how many actors can actually get involved in it? But could it have a big implications for a governance system, right? So that would be, climate change is of course a big deal, and it's well, if depending on what press sources you see with the next administration, if Joe Biden wins, then we're going to be going back to looking at earth science maybe. And so, would these, even though these areas may not be big ticket items in terms of the market, could they have wide implications for other areas, such
Right.
as detecting greenhouse gas emissions, which is itself a huge undertaking and is a big part of the economy.
Right. And there's a lot of specialized technology that goes with that. So it's interesting. I personally worked on other types of treaty verification,
Okay.
and it can be very challenging. And a lot of it is very much a detail technical problem, and states that want to cheat for various reasons. It's a bit of a game of chess between those who need to verify and those who want to cheat, and it's almost like a little miniature arms race. And it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. As we approach the end of the hour, and thank you so much again for taking all this time with us. I would like to ask for your recommendations on how to move the needle in a positive way for society and economics. What can governments do, today and tomorrow, to both help people, but to balance between the need for the commercialization, because at some level that will drive all of this forward. But also to make sure that the stakeholders of society are part of that.
Mm-hmm.
What recommendations would you have?
Yeah, so welcome to my TED Talk to basically say that, trust and confidence building is so important. We are so divided, and, everything is, feels so partisan and political. And so we need to find more middle ground approaches. And that is very complicated, and that is very difficult, because sometimes the middle ground is like the lowest common denominator, or can feel like a cop-out. But I think in the policy realm, just trying to do better at negotiating and at coming up with what are the positions that suits people and will move the needle further, with respect to helping society and helping people, is super important. And I think this is super important for space people, because we're not very good at making the case for why what we're doing is important. I think space people have this idea that, it's a given that there are all these benefits from space, or it's a given that people should care about space, rather than actually making the case for it. And so I think, scientists and engineers, who are the ones who understand the technology, have to be more open to making the case for what they do, which means getting better understanding of policy rationales, of the different issues that people are facing, outside of the space realm. So it's almost like getting out of the echo chamber, going to different discussions, hearing different inputs, and really making sure that space is relevant to the everyday man. And I think, to be honest, like, it feels like a good thing to use all these references like Star Wars and Star Trek, but I think that they're very unhelpful today, because we're moving beyond this whole space being a geeks thing, and trying to say that we want viable sectors, we want viable participation. And so we now have to start speaking from a standpoint that better understands where space actually fits in. So I would say that governance, scientists and engineers need to take into consideration more things about public policy, more issues about governance, more understanding about how you balance interests and how you think of all the wide range of concerns. And probably that's what Congress does. But I think for everyone else, we need to start being part of that too.
And so how does that play with innovators and entrepreneurs, which are kind of, perhaps in some ways, many of us are hoping and looking to innovation and entrepreneurship to drive space and create these economies, create opportunities for jobs, enable economic development around the world, in much the same way that software did. But it is a fundamentally different beast, right? You can't do a space project in your dorm room with 2 years of education. but maybe we will enable that. I mean, the space has been democratized. It's $2,000 a kilogram, so a student group can save beer money, for a couple of years and put up a microsatellite, right? With $3,000 or $4,000. So how do you see, or rather, what advice would you give to innovators and entrepreneurs in terms of how to think about space and space application, space commercialization? Because it clearly seems that there is this massive opportunity for the people who can innovate around it to grab the benefits to society, the benefit to the common man for space. Whereas there's already the billion and trillion dollar companies that are addressing the security and the defense needs. It seems that the economic opportunity is really in serving people. So,
right. So it's important to have these discussions with non-space people to really get them to understand, because I think some of what we've seen with the investment coming in, or the actors, the non-space people that are coming into space, is that these two groups are not really talking to each other. And so if you're non-space, you're coming in and not really understanding the nuances and the challenges of space. And then if you're space, you're not, getting to the wider market and looking at, like what's actually going on in society. And so I think it's important to have a lot more discussions about, about what the next opportunities are, who we need to serve, why we should care about non-traditional actors in non-traditional markets. So I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I'm always going to say dialogue, and engineers and scientists are always going to say we need action. But I would say, like, figuring out who the people that you should talk to. I mean, like, I would say Kalis Partners, for instance, really do great work. Kalis Foundation, they do great work about trying to demystify a lot of space and the space business. And so I think having more groups like that who really understand the economics of this is super important, and to have those discussions with the right people is important.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your insight. I want to ask you one last question, and then we should wrap up. What are you most excited about right now that's happening in the space sector? Whether it's societal, whether it's some new bit of tech. Just curious as to what is exciting to you right now.
Yeah, so international law is super old. It's like really, really,
Right.
really
The Antarctic Treaty is what, 100 years old or more, something?
It's super old, and space is one of the only areas that is dynamic. It is like, because we have all these activities that are coming online, and we have no proper, identified, not that we don't have a framework, but we don't have implementing steps towards realizing this future. So I think right now is a really interesting place to get educated. We still have some time to get educated on what the dynamics are in the space environment, and bring lessons learned from other regimes, from other experiences in the space sector. And it's not closed off. It's not just for lawyers. It's basically a dynamic area that even scientists and engineers who are imagining these futures can participate in. And I think programs like mine at the School for the Future of Innovation and Society are really geared towards how do we think more inclusively about the future, and not keeping disciplines in their silos, like saying space law is just for lawyers, or
right.
Like basically everyone needs to come together to sit around the table and really plan what these futures will look like, what the barriers are, what the and how you can develop the regime to forward, not just to be like, not just to say, oh no, you can't do that, but to be permissive. Because I think that's what the US is looking for. They're looking for permissive regimes, but do that in the context of recognizing that, like all the problems that we had with Facebook, they never thought about at the beginning, would we have
right.
all those changes. So yes, we need permissive regimes, but if we bring everyone to the table and have as many different perspectives as possible, then we can make sure that those regimes account for as many of the problems that we could face kind of later on. So I'm really excited for governance as a topic, and I'm really excited about telling people that just because we talk about inclusion doesn't mean that we're not going to let things happen. We're not just
Right.
trying to stop everything.
It's finding the right path through. Well, thank you so much once again, Professor Timiebi Aganaba Jeanty of Arizona State University, and one of the leading voices on space governance. It sounds like you're going to be very busy for quite a while on these issues, and us technologists are likely to throw you some curveballs, but hopefully that'll keep things interesting. Thank you
Yes,
once
thank
again
you.
for joining us on the America Future Series, Space Talks series, and thank you very much to our sponsors and our audience. Take care, folks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.